Welcome to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership, where you'll hear insights and useful strategies, as well as lessons learned from other nonprofit leaders and valuable tips from a variety of experts. Here to help you with the challenges and opportunities you face day after day is your host and nonprofit leadership expert, Sarah Olivieri.
Hello, nonprofit leaders, and welcome to your go-to place for information and inspiration to help you be even more effective. I'm your host, Sarah Olivieri, and you're listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. I have a special guest for you today, Ted Bilch from Madison, Wisconsin, who is the founder and CEO of Risk Alternatives, which works with nonprofits around the United States to improve resilience and sustainability. Before founding Risk Alternatives, Ted was a distinguished visiting professor from practice at Georgetown University Law Center. And even before that, he spent more than 20 years in the Washington, D.C. office of an international law firm. Ted speaks regularly around the United States about resilience, risk management, strategic planning, process improvement, and other topics, many of which are some of my favorites. He also is the author of the book, Managing Your Nonprofit for Resilience. Welcome, Ted. Before we dive into our topic, talking about risk and nonprofits, would you share a little bit about yourself personally?
Absolutely, Sarah. I'm so delighted to be here. And here is Madison, Wisconsin, which is something that is personal to me in my life. We lived in the DC area for about 30 years. And so I was there long enough to become a DC native. But about 2 years ago, we decided we wanted to get back to the Midwest. And so we are in Madison, Wisconsin, which is fantastic because everyone else has to go someplace for lakes. We have 4 lakes right close by.
Excellent. I love it. I love being on the water. I'm a sailboat racer myself. So I'm always looking for good water with good wind. Anyway, let's talk about risk. So, I think and risk management. So I'd love for you to start with, why should nonprofits be investing in risk management to begin with? No, that's not the first thing
Sarah,
people think of when they think of where they're going to invest.
No, well, the first thing they think of is never risk management when they're thinking, what do I spend my time, talent, and treasure on? But it's to me, it's counterintuitive. And I understand that for me, everything's a nail because I've got a hammer. But my intuition is that until you identify what your threats and opportunities are and decide which ones of those many things you could focus on, you're really sort of whistling in the dark. And at bottom, that's what risk management is about. It's about being radically aware of what you don't know and what you do know, and then taking the next reasonable step in response.
Yeah.
And that is something that I think every nonprofit should institutionalize as a process, and we call that risk management.
Yeah. I sometimes when I think about risk management, I wish it was called risk intelligence, because I think let me step back. I think nonprofits have a really kind of messed up relationship with risk. They're like simultaneously told, like, don't risk anything because you're supposed to be good stewards of your donors' money, but they don't really have a good relationship with risk, and usually not risking things to them translates to avoiding doing stuff. And oftentimes that's more risky than taking action. Which is all to say that there's a lot that goes into being smart about your risks. So you've written the book on it. Tell me a little more about, just frame this up. What is risk management? What are the things we should be thinking about when we're thinking about risk management?
Sure. It's a little bit, I studied French in college and I can't remember, but there's a play about a guy who goes throughout his life and then he becomes really excited because he learns that he has been speaking prose all his life. Well, risk management is a little like that. I guarantee you that everyone who is listening to this podcast or watching this podcast is taking steps that are steps addressing risk. as you said, Sarah, the nonprofit business model is an inherently risky business model. And therefore, you can't avoid taking risk if you're a nonprofit executive director or CEO. What we tell people is, can we put together the things that you are currently doing and put them into a cadence that would allow you to rely on them to identify things even when you're not looking for them. And so what we suggest is that a nonprofit that wants to dip its toe in the water of risk management would start by doing what we call a risk identification exercise, where you look at each functional area and you look for threats, bad things. But importantly, Sarah, you also look for opportunities because, as you said, a risk is not just bad things. And so you want to be looking for things that you can capture as additional value for your organization. You can capture as additional parts of your stewardship obligation that you were talking about. Things that you can do better are also risks that you should be capturing.
Yeah.
But if you do that inventory, it's going to end up, you're going to have 70 to 100 things. I know that because I've done it with hundreds of organizations. You can't focus on 70 to 100 things. So you then go through a simple prioritization to say, what are we going to focus on? What are the 5 or 6 top things we're going to focus on? And let's really track those things. And let's bless and release or delegate downward those other things that were on our inventory, so that you're focusing on taking the most high value, reasonable step. Then you respond to it. And respond doesn't necessarily mean fix it. It means address it in some way. Maybe you research it. Maybe you decide to altogether stop doing what is triggering the risk, so you avoid the risk. Maybe the risk is so critical to your operations that all you can do is try to mitigate it. Work to make sure that if it happens, it won't be as bad.
Yeah.
If it's a positive risk, you wouldn't want to mitigate it. You'd want to develop it. And then there are other things you can do to a risk, but it's not a binary choice, have risk, solve. Instead, it's a process of seeing what works in addressing that risk.
Yeah.
And then the fourth is institutionalizing it as a cycle. So making sure that you identify some more, prioritize some more, respond some more, assess and improve, and so on and so forth. Sarah.
Yeah, that's so great. I couldn't help but think, of course, my sailor brain gets turned on easily. I was just at a regatta sailing with someone who has a boat that's new to them, but it's an old boat, and it needed some refinements in how it was set up. So between 2 days of racing, what our risk, our problem that was plaguing us was we couldn't make an in-out adjustment on a sail because the way our boat was set up. And we found a way to get an in-out adjustment, but we would lose, because of our temporary rigging, the ability to go back and forth, essentially. And so we ran that little kind of cost benefit analysis. We said, well, we'd much rather have the ability to come in and out, or we actually wanted it to go out, but it doesn't matter. It's technical sailing stuff. And we're okay losing that back and, front and back movement temporarily, because if the in out works like we think it's going to, we can then in the next iteration, when we are back at the shop, add the forward and back. But if we didn't test it, we knew that we'd be continuing to suffer by not having this positioning that every other boat had, because they were newer and a slightly different design. And that's it. That's part of what I love sailing. It's like a little microcosm of the things we apply to our bigger worlds.
Absolutely is. And critical to what you were doing, Sarah, was you were actually letting the situation tell you the response in certain ways. You weren't sitting in a conference room saying, what would happen if? Instead, you are letting the data tell you, oh, if we do this, there will be this consequence, but that's something that we can address. And so let's look at the trade-offs and make the choice that we can.
Right.
Perfect example.
And test it out.
Management.
So many changes we make in our organizations, it doesn't mean it has to be permanent forever. You can design an experiment that you can test relatively safely. And we had come up with plans, how we could undo it if we really hated it on the water, or, we still had a third day of racing. We could change things up if we needed to, if it was bad as well. I want to
Yeah, I love that
I
example.
want to ask you, because you've worked with a lot of nonprofits and seen a lot of things in those list of 100 things. Are there things that for nonprofits, the same types of risks that come up again and again that are often in the top? If you could share a few of those, I'd love to know what they are.
Absolutely. Well, let me handle that in two ways. First of all, you're right that risks can show up in a variety of different places. And one of the things that I will share with you that I hope that you'll be able to share with your listeners is Appendix 2 of my book, where I list lots of questions that can be used for purposes of reflection and team discussion. If someone is thinking about the risk management process and how it impacts talent management. Here are 15 questions about talent management, that kind of thing. Um, but but as to the core of your question, what comes up time and time and time again? One is executive succession.
Mm.
Uh, that is one of the hottest topics right now in the nonprofit space, and it's one of those things that often does not come up until there is an issue. And the risk management process, that inventory process, usually triggers someone to be brave enough to say, "What happens if Jane is no longer here?" Or Jane herself will say, I'm a boomer and eventually I'm going to leave. And so that's one that comes up all the time.
Mhm.
A second one that comes up all the time, Sarah, is process. The fact that they have so many issues in the average nonprofit that are in the brain of senior management or in the brain of the boots on the ground. But if the senior management or the boots on the ground leave, you're going to lose an important part of how we do things in this nonprofit. And so sometimes that will show up as disgruntlement in the staff because they feel like they don't have a clear perception of what they're supposed to do.
Mhm.
Uh, Sometimes that will come up from the standpoint of uh, not just executive succession, but succession and turnover more generally. But the underlying issue is the fact that they don't have documentation of the core things that make their nonprofit their nonprofit. And then the third one that comes up more and more over the last 18 months, Sarah, is we've heard of this thing called artificial intelligence. We don't know quite what to do about it. And we know that it's supposed to make us all more productive, but we also know that it's very biased. And so we figure that it's a danger. And so that issue of how do we grapple with something bigger than ourselves, this whirlwind of artificial intelligence is coming up all the time.
Yeah. Oh, I love that one. And so just the first one you mentioned about, the first two, process and leadership
Success.
transition, succession. I see that all the time because a lot of clients come to me realizing that risk and coming. I teach a strategic leadership framework. And one of the things I talk about is if we only think of leadership as in the skills and talents and styles of the people, we're missing this huge other piece of leadership, which are the systems, structures, and processes. And if you design your leadership to function more around processes and be less reliant or less susceptible to the changes of individuals, we build a much more robust organization. I like to think of it just like, like a democracy is a very system heavy type of leadership model, as opposed to a monarchy, which is very much a person authority power type leadership model. And we need to be thinking about these intentionally, partly as a means of risk reduction, because it greatly impacts those two things you mentioned.
Yes, absolutely, Sarah.
And I'm curious about the AI. Maybe we can even use that, since this is something that so many people are thinking about. I'd love to just kind of think out loud with you. How do you think about? I know I certainly can chime in with mine, but I want to hear yours. Like, how do you think about that conversation in a group or in your head around the pros and cons and benefits and risks and rewards and opportunities that AI is bringing. How do you think about this issue?
Well, first of all, I think that there's AI as a structure that may fundamentally change our culture and society. That's one that none of us can really impact that much. The idea of AI taking over certain decision making, or AI somehow becoming an all-inclusive big brother. I urge people, set that aside. That is a critical issue, but it's an issue that is not within our sphere of influence.
Hmm.
What is in our sphere of influence are there ways that we can use the tools of AI? And in particular, I focus on ChatGPT and its analogous things. Is there a way that we can use ChatGPT to improve our nonprofit? And as to that, I am a huge evangelist. I believe that any nonprofit leader who is not spending about an hour interacting with ChatGPT in a given week, and for me, it's in a given day, but at least once a week, interacting and using it as a sounding board.
Yeah.
If they're not doing that, they're not using AI as they currently should be, because ChatGPT allows for so much inquiry and so much structural back and forth that is of value. And a nonprofit leader who, I hear it, I'm sure you hear it, Sarah, everyone says it's so lonely at the top. Well, ChatGPT is there to help think through critical issues. And so I really urge people to consider ChatGPT an advisor, and indeed a trusted advisor, because while it is, there are biases built into it, those biases pale by comparison to the average bias of the human brain.
Yeah.
So you're getting a better product when you talk to ChatGPT.
I love that.
How about
and
you?
well, I mean, first of all, I agree with you in telling people like whether or not AI is going to be amazing for the world or destroy the world, like that's another topic. But AI is going to be in the world in a big way. And for that, I'd say worry about it in that you should be learning how to use this technology because it's here. It's like, imagine like when the internet came out, if you decide, or if computers came out and you're like, I'm not going to learn computers. It's not going to be that important. You'd be way left behind. It is coming for whatever it's going to change our world. Everyone's using it almost already. And you need to be, this is a technology you must keep up with, or you're putting your organization at risk, right? You're falling
Absolutely.
behind the curve. You can't ignore this. And
Absolutely.
then as far as like, how do we use it? I think people will find their ways, continually think about creative ways to use it. For me, sometimes I use it as an advisor. Oftentimes I use it to translate my communication into other forms. So I often communicate by video, talking to people, calls, video calls or going live. And I use it to help me write, which is very different from having it write something from scratch, which wouldn't be very me. But the combination of training it to talk like me and then feeding it a transcript of me, I get stuff from it that is very me and saves me a lot of time. And in fact, it lets me, for me, writing is not enjoyable. And so if I didn't have it, I wouldn't be able to produce this medium that makes resources more accessible for a lot of people. Reading something is often, in many cases, more accessible to some people, and video is more accessible to others. So I think this is true for nonprofits. We can be increasing the accessibility of resources we're putting out by having multiple formats that we couldn't produce that much. And I think there are opportunities. And like you said, I think many people benefit having an advisor. I think it's partly what the AI knows, but it's partly just that's how our brains operate. Like we work through story, we work through conversation, we are social beings. And AI is kind of social, and it can, just like when you tell your friend, your problem and you figure out the solution from your own talking, right? Your friend just needs to like listen compassionately. Like AI is there to listen compassionately whenever you want. It never gets tired of you.
Absolutely.
Um,
No, I love those thoughts. And for me, what I use it for more than anything else is to as a thought partner as I'm exploring an area.
yeah.
Because, I think one of the challenges of being, well, expert in an area is that you've built a lot of blinders on yourself. In
Absolutely.
order to focus your expertise, you have cut things out of your perception. And
Absolutely.
so being able to have someone who is not facing those disabilities as a sounding board is critically important to my creative
Yeah.
process.
I love that you
And
mentioned
and
that.
that,
Hmm.
that that's as someone who loves to write, and yet it's not. Well, I think that it is of so much value that if your listeners took one gem away from this conversation, it would be think of the tool that's there and use the tool. Now, in doing that, Sarah, I always advise people spend the $20 a month to get ChatGPT Pro. That way you can turn off the learn function so that it is not taking your data and using it as it evolves its brain. That way you're not worried about giving away things that are internal to your company. But having done that, as you said, Sarah, if you are not using it, putting your organization in peril.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. And, even as you were talking about biases, right? So we're always at risk of our own brain biases, whether we're an expert or not. And you can go read up about heuristics and all sorts of, but recency bias that we have in our own brains. So don't think you're getting away from biases by just talking to yourself or talking to another person. We all have biases. It's not something unique, and we can take advantage of the fact that chat gpt is biased in some ways and maybe unbiased in other ways, and you can turn on and off its training, right? You could say like, don't think about everything me, or do think about. You can kind of control its biases to a certain degree as well, um, by thinking about how you tell
Absolutely.
it you want it to think, because you can tell it how to think.
And so, Sarah, if someone were trying to create an employment policy, one thing they could do would be to simply do a PDF of their current employee handbook, give it to ChatGPT. It wants it in PDF form, but you could say, we need a whistleblower policy. We want it to be, act in the role of an expert in human resources. And in that role, provide a whistleblower policy that is consistent with the tone and tenor of the document that I provided to you.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you that's going to be a better policy than if you sat down and tried to write your whistleblower policy. And of course, maybe you run it by an attorney, but it's a better one than most attorneys would put together as well.
Absolutely. Attorneys are only human too.
Right.
So before we run out of time, I do want to switch gears from AI and ask you about strategy, because I know you've done some strategic planning work, and I think so much about risk management and strategy go hand in hand. I know when I talk to my clients, there's the what you're going to do in your strategy, like the tactics, but the timing, the when of a strategy is so key. And especially, I think when it comes to thinking about, avoiding risks and taking advantage of opportunities. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the connection between risk management and strategy.
Sure. When I started this business a decade ago, we started gathering research. And one of the things that we found was somewhere around 79% of the nonprofits that we were interacting with, they have a strategic plan, but only about 20% of them had what they believed was a risk management process.
Mm.
And that goes to that point that I say in my book about how if you've got a strategic plan, but you don't have a risk management process, then really all you have is a strategic hope or aspiration, because it does you no good to say, I'm going to plant my flag on that mountain over there, if you have no basis for orienteering along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, critically important, Sarah, to decide what mountains you're going to plant your flag on. But you got to know what's in your backpack, and you got to have your eyes and your ears open on the path to see the bad things, the threats that could happen, but also the opportunities, the logs that have fallen across creeks so that you don't need to try to ford the creek on your own. You need to have that orienteering.
Yeah.
And risk management is critically important to that. So critical that a couple of years ago, we decided that we wanted to train on strategic planning. And as part of our standard offering for strategic planning, when you do a strategic plan with us, the ultimate deciding what mountains to capture, is a relatively small part of it. More is focused on what are our current capacities? What are our threats now to our business model? What are our opportunities now to the business model? So that then a strategic plan becomes not a dry thing that sits on a shelf somewhere, but instead the directions about orienteering between where you want to go and where you currently are, and what you have available and what you need and what you can develop and what you can do in the moment.
Yeah.
And so that is, to me, the essence of what we call lean strategic planning. The idea of, again, letting the data inform your decisions every step of the way.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. For my listeners who know, talked about the way we do strategic planning with my clients and the impact method. They do strategic planning every 2 months. And it is very much, the length of time that it covers really depends on the type of goal and the information that we have. If you just replaced your roof with a 30-year roof, might as well set a 30-year goal to change that roof. But maybe something is moving very fast. Maybe they need to do planning even more frequently than 2 months in an emergency situation, but they have those skills. And there's so much, like you said, it is orienteering, right? Most nonprofits, not all of them, but most of them are solving our world's most complex unsolved problems. And you can't do that without innovating, and you can't innovate without exploring and experimenting. They're literally moving into uncharted territory. And you need to be able to orient. You need to be able to, go where there aren't roads or obvious paths that have been laid out before. And you better be really good at strategy and tactics and execution. And like you said, the principles of lean, the principles of agile iteration, these things are so much at play. They should be at play in nonprofits, and they have to be at play, I believe, if you want to make an impact.
From your lips to the ears of every nonprofit leader. I love it.
That's my little, I really have this, my own mission or passion with the way I see the space is that, so often nonprofits are like, oh, it's kind of business, but nobody looks to the nonprofit space for innovation. And I wish they did. I wish that when the world thought about what are the most innovative business sectors, they don't look at Google. They look at the nonprofit space and that's how I think it should be.
I love that as well. I think that as you said, nonprofits deal with the issues that are either too politically divisive, or they deal with groups that we would rather ignore.
That's right.
And as a result of that, innovation is critical to the quiver that you have on your back as you address those issues.
I love it. Well, as we wrap up, I'd love to hear any final words of advice or inspiration, how people can get your book and get in touch with you, and who should get in touch with you as well, so people know who are the right people to get your book or get in touch.
Sure. Well, the best way to find me is always tedbillich.com. That's TEDBILICH.com. And there people will find blog posts and downloads and videos, other things that they can use to improve their resilience and sustainability. As I mentioned, Sarah, one of the things that I will give to you that I hope that you can put in your show notes
Absolutely.
is a link to that appendix, because even if you don't get my book, which you can get at Amazon or anywhere else, you can get a taste for it by looking at that appendix, where if you wanted to sit down and think about, your finance function or your compliance function, and reflect on how you feel about it now and whether there is room for improvement, that appendix would allow you to think about the issues that a risk manager would ask you to think about. So I urge people, take a look at that. It's very valuable. But Sarah, more than anything else, I just wanted to say thank you. I think that we are kindred spirits in our approach. More importantly, it is so wonderful that you have this show, because nonprofit leaders need to have trusted advisors, and you obviously are one.
Oh, thank you. And you are too. Well, we'll have those links in the show notes for anybody who's listening while doing other things or just doesn't want to type. They'll be there for you. Thank you so much, Ted, for your time today and your decades of dedication to this important topic for nonprofits. And thank you out there for listening, but also for all that you do to make our communities better. I know how it feels. I've been an executive director multiple times, board member multiple times, and I'm very honored and fortunate to be a consultant and coach to nonprofits like yours. I know your challenges firsthand, and I want to bring you as much bite-sized, accessible information and inspiration as I can, which is why, in addition to the guest episodes I bring to you on this podcast, I've also created the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter, where you can get bite-sized, actionable weekly tips delivered to your email inbox. And you can access that at inspirednonprofitleadership.com/sign up. Again, there'll be a link in the show notes to make it easy for you. Take care of yourself, take time for self-care, take time to do some risk management, and be sure to subscribe. And if you would, leave a review for this podcast. It helps other nonprofits find it. Until next time, all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.